At 5:17 a.m. on October 12th, 1943, Jimmy Thatch pulled the trigger that saved an entire unit. One impossible shot fired through fog, chaos, and the collapse of everything around him turned what should have been a massacre into a miracle of survival. Moments like that don't appear in textbooks. They live only in the memories of the men who stood on the edge of death and refused to fall. The forest was still that morning, still in the way that only battlefields could be, where silence was never peace, only the brief inhale before something terrible exhaled. A thin curtain of mist clung to the ground, swirling around the roots of fallen pines and the broken spines of artillery-shattered branches. If you had stood there, in that gray half-light, you might have believed time had stopped. But for Jimmy Thatch, kneeling behind a jagged stump with his fingers wrapped around the walnut stock of his rifle, time was doing the opposite. It was accelerating, pulling him toward a fate he had never wanted, yet could no longer avoid. In those moments, he wasn't thinking about glory or medals or the names of battles that historians would later argue over. He was thinking of something painfully simple. Breathe in, breathe out. His father had taught him that when he was only 9 years old, his cheek pressed against this very same rifle stock, the wood warm beneath the summer sun. A man who can command his breath, his father had said, can command the world for half a second. Half a second was all a marksman ever truly owned. But half a second on the Thatch family farm was nothing like half a second in the European theater. Here, the air itself felt heavier, thick with cordite, damp soil, and the faint, metallic scent of blood, some fresh, some old, very old. Jimmy could smell it, even when he tried not to. Before the war, people described him as quiet, observant, the kind of young man who said little but saw much. That wasn't something he had learned. It was something he had always been. Even as a boy, he would sit by the barn for hours, studying how the wind bent the tall grass, or how sparrows shifted direction mid-flight without colliding. He had a strange gift for noticing the things most people never stopped long enough to see. His mother assumed it meant he was destined to become a teacher. His father thought it meant something else, something that couldn't be named until the world forced it out. When the war started, Jimmy hadn't rushed to enlist like some boys did, swept up in patriotic fever. He hesitated. His older brother, Samuel, didn't. Samuel was the storm, loud, fearless, a wildfire of a young man. Jimmy was the quiet river beside him. When Samuel's deployment orders arrived, Jimmy stood on the porch with him long after their parents had gone inside. Samuel had clapped a hand on his shoulder and said, "If anything happens to me, you take care of Ma. You hear?" Jimmy heard. He always heard. And maybe that was the problem, he heard too much. 2 months later, when a telegraph officer rode up the Thatch dirt road, Jimmy understood before anyone else why the man didn't dismount right away. The soldier's stiff posture, the way he avoided eye contact, the folded paper, trembling in his gloved hand. Jimmy saw the truth before a single word was spoken. The world shifted that day. And when he walked into the recruitment office the next morning, holding his father's rifle, the sergeant behind the desk raised an eyebrow. "Planning to fight the war with that antique?" he asked. Jimmy had nodded once. It hits what it aims at. People think vengeance feels hot, like fire. Jimmy learned early that vengeance, real vengeance, feels cold, like the slow freezing of something inside your chest. Basic training didn't change him the way it changed others. Some recruits were broken down so they could be rebuilt. Jimmy didn't break. He adapted. He listened more than he spoke. He watched the instructors with a kind of clinical intensity, committing every movement, every order, every misstep to memory. At night, while the others played cards or wrote letters home, he disassembled and reassembled his rifle over and over until he could do it blindfolded, his hands moving with the grace of a craftsman. A few of the men mocked him for it. Others mocked his old rifle. One corporal joked that Jimmy would be lucky if the thing didn't explode in his hands the first time he fired it. Jimmy never responded. What would have been the point? Words couldn't reveal what the rifle truly was. A connection to the brother he couldn't save, and to the father who had taught him that mastery was measured not by noise, but by discipline. When deployment day came, The sky over the docks was a washed-out blue, the kind that made everything look colder than it was. Soldiers filed up the ramp of the transport ship, each man carrying his own private weight. Some wore bravado on their faces like a mask. Others couldn't hide the fear twisting in their stomachs. Jimmy walked up the ramp silently, the rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes fixed on a horizon he knew would never look the same after this. And here's the question that lingers for anyone listening. If it had been you, standing in his boots, would you have felt courage, or only the fear of becoming someone you didn't recognize? War has a way of forcing men to discover parts of themselves they never planned to meet. As the ship pulled away, Jimmy stood at the rail, watching the coastline fade into a thin brown line. The wind whipped at his hair, and for a fleeting moment he imagined he could still hear Samuel laughing somewhere behind him. But when he turned, there was only the endless sea and the sound of waves slapping against steel. He tightened his grip on the rifle strap. Whatever waited for him across that ocean, he would face it not because he wanted to, but because fate had left him nowhere else to go. The first weeks overseas changed Jimmy in ways he didn't yet understand. The war had a way of stripping men down, not all at once, but layer by layer, like bark peeling from a storm-beaten tree. Even before he fired a single shot in anger, the weight of the European air heavy with diesel, mud, and the scent of wet uniforms drying too slowly pressed itself onto him. It wasn't fear that settled inside him during those early days. It was something quieter, a sharpening, like the edge of a blade being honed. Training camps near the front were nothing like the fields of Tennessee. The ground here was darker, richer, as if it had absorbed too much blood over the years and refused to let any of it go. Soldiers marched from dawn until long after the sun dipped behind the hills, their boots pounding into soil that remembered every battle fought across it. Jimmy moved among them without complaint, his eyes always scanning, always measuring. He saw patterns, how men grouped themselves during breaks, who kept to themselves, who cracked under pressure, and who rose above it. Without trying, he understood what made people tick, and perhaps more importantly, what made them break. One of the sergeants noticed. During marksmanship drills, Jimmy consistently hit targets others struggled with. At 300 yards, he was flawless. At 500 yards, he was better than most. When the wind abruptly shifted and half the platoon missed their shots, Jimmy adjusted without hesitation. The sergeant walked behind him, squinting at the antique rifle. "That thing really doing all the work?" he muttered. Jimmy didn't answer. The truth was simple. The rifle was just wood and steel. The rest came from the boy who had grown up reading wind like scripture. Still, not everyone appreciated him. Some men whispered that Jimmy was odd, too quiet, too observant, too calm for someone facing the greatest war the world had ever seen. Others mocked him openly, especially the ones threatened by anything they didn't understand. They joked about his rifle, called it a museum piece, a relic. One afternoon, a private named Delaney pointed at it and said loudly, "Hope you brought a spare, Thatch. That thing looks like it needs a funeral more than a firing line." The men around him laughed. Jimmy simply checked the bolt, wiped a fleck of dust from the stock, and walked away. Later that night, when the barracks were quiet, Delaney approached him with a sheepish grin. "Hey, you know I was just messing around, right?" Jimmy nodded once. There was no anger in him, only distance. Perhaps Delaney sensed it too, because he didn't try to make conversation after that. Sleep became harder as the unit moved closer to the front. Nights were filled with sounds that didn't belong distant artillery, trucks grinding over roads that had seen too many tanks, the quiet sobbing of men who tried to hide it under blankets. The closer they got, the more Jimmy sensed the shift in the air. Men walked differently. Jokes became shorter, louder, more desperate. Cigarettes were smoked faster. Letters home were written slower. One night, as rain hammered against the canvas roof of their tent, Jimmy lay awake, staring at the dim glow of a lantern swinging in the wind. The men around him snored or murmured in restless sleep. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the space where Samuel should have been. War wasn't giving him closure. It was opening new wounds, deeper ones, and yet something inside him steadied. Maybe it was the rhythm of the rain. Maybe it was the memory of his father's voice saying, "A man can't choose what world he's born into, but he can choose how he stands in it. At dawn, orders came. Their unit was being pushed forward. Not to the front line exactly, but close enough to feel its breathing. Trucks rumbled along muddy roads, sliding over ruts deep enough to swallow boots whole. Jimmy sat squeezed between two soldiers, their rifles banging against their knees, the cold morning air stinging their cheeks. As the convoy wound deeper into the forest, he felt the landscape tightening around them. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisted like bony arms reaching toward the gray sky. Mist drifted low, curling around the wheels of the trucks, rising and falling like ghosts of soldiers long dead. The forest felt alive, not welcoming, but watchful. "Feels like we're driving straight into the devil's living room," someone muttered. No one disagreed. When they finally reached the forward encampment, Jimmy stepped off the truck and felt the ground tremble not from fear, but from distant explosions. The earth groaned under the weight of the war being fought miles away. Men hurried past carrying crates of ammunition, their faces smeared with dirt, exhaustion etched into every line. A lieutenant briefed them near a half-collapsed bunker. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed the truth. No one was fully prepared for what lay ahead. They were short on scouts, short on sharpshooters, short on everything except danger. Jimmy listened quietly, memorizing every contour of the map, every approach route, every likely ambush point. When the meeting ended, the lieutenant pulled him aside. "Thatch, right? Heard you shoot straight." Jimmy nodded. "You stay close these next few days. We need eyes that can actually see." That night, Jimmy sat outside the tent, sharpening his knife, though he knew he might never use it. He wasn't sharpening metal, he was sharpening focus. The forest around him murmured with wind and distant gunfire, and he felt the war pressing closer not as an enemy, but as a tide that couldn't be held back. And here's where you might ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you're pushed toward a line that could end your life, do you look back at what you were, or forward toward what you're about to become? Jimmy looked forward. He had no other choice. The first real engagement didn't resemble any of the training exercises. Men liked to believe they were prepared, that drills and lectures and practice trenches could somehow harden them into warriors. But the forest shattered that illusion in seconds. The air smelled different when death was close. It had a thick, almost metallic humidity to it, as if the earth itself exhaled before swallowing whatever came next. Jimmy sensed the ambush before it happened. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was the absence of one. Birds stopped calling. The wind paused mid-breath. Even the mud felt still beneath his boots, as if the forest were bracing for impact. He touched the bolt of his rifle, a subconscious gesture more than anything, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. The lieutenant walked ahead, whispering orders and pointing out the narrow path twisting between the pines. Their squad moved carefully, boots sinking into moss that muffled almost every sound. But not every sound. Jimmy heard it, the faint, unnatural creak of a branch bending under weight. Not wind, not animal, human. He opened his mouth to warn the sergeant, but it was too late. The first machine gun burst tore through the trees like lightning, ripping open the sky. Bark exploded in a violent shower. Branches snapped and fluttered to the ground. Bullets hissed past Jimmy's ear, so close he felt the air ripple. A man behind him dropped without even crying out, his helmet rolling into the ferns. Chaos swallowed the squad. Some men threw themselves into the dirt, others froze. One screamed for help before another burst hit him and cut the scream short. The forest erupted with smoke and the metallic smell of ruptured steel, the air instantly thick with fear and gunpowder. Jimmy slid behind the root of a fallen spruce, heart pounding, breath sharp and mechanical. But beneath it all was something else, an eerie clarity, as though the world had suddenly slowed around him. He could see the angles of fire, the rhythm of the enemy bursts, the flicker of muzzle flashes hiding in the brambles. He could even see the slight shimmer of heat above the barrel of the enemy gun. He had seen this before, not the battlefield, but the patterns. The same way crows scattered when a fox crept near. The same way wind bent differently seconds before a storm. It was all there, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Crawling through mud, Jimmy steadied his rifle and calculated distance the way his father had taught him by instinct more than math. The enemy gunner was well hidden, tucked between roots, shielded by branches, firing in short, disciplined bursts meant to pin them down. For the briefest moment, Jimmy wondered how young the German gunner was, whether he had a mother waiting at home, whether he too once learned to shoot beside a father who never imagined this future for his son. But the thought was gone as fast as it came. War didn't leave room for meditation. Jimmy inhaled. Then he waited not for silence, but for the tiniest break in the gunner's pattern. A half-second pause, an exhale, a shift of weight, and when it came, Jimmy squeezed the trigger. His shot cracked through the woods, a single precise sound that cut through the machine gun chaos like a scalpel. The muzzle flashes stopped, the gun jammed, or maybe the gunner simply fell. Jimmy didn't wait to confirm it. He was already shifting, scanning, anticipating the next threat. But others were not so fortunate. A grenade landed near Corporal Meyer, bouncing once on the soft earth. Meyer lunged to throw it back, but slipped. The blast swallowed him in a flash of white and dirt and flame. Jimmy felt the shockwave roll past him, pushing air from his lungs. When the smoke thinned, Meyer's body was lying in pieces that didn't resemble the man he'd been 5 minutes earlier. Something inside Jimmy tightened. Not grief, not yet. Something colder. The squad rallied under the lieutenant's orders, returning fire, pushing forward inch by brutal inch. Jimmy moved through it all with a sense of detachment, as though his mind stood several feet above his own body, observing, calculating, guiding him through motions his muscles already understood. When the firing faded and the forest returned to its uneasy silence, the survivors gathered in a tight cluster. Some cursed under their breath, some cried openly. One man, Delaney, the same private who once mocked Jimmy's rifle, sat trembling, eyes wide, staring at Meyer's remains. Jimmy didn't tremble, but not because he was fearless. He felt the tremor somewhere deeper, in the place where Samuel's death had once carved a hollow space that he'd never filled. The battlefield pressed against that hollow now, as if trying to widen it. The lieutenant approached Jimmy, wiping grime from his face. "Thatch," he said, catching his breath. "That shot. You saved the whole left flank. If that gun had kept firing, we'd have been torn apart." Jimmy didn't respond. He didn't feel pride. He didn't feel relief. Only a strange soreness behind the eyes, the kind that came from things a man wasn't meant to witness. As they moved out, stepping around bodies and shattered branches, Jimmy paused for a moment to watch a thin column of smoke drifting upward between the trees. It twisted slowly, rising into the gray sky like a warning. And here is where you, the listener, must confront something uncomfortable. In that moment, surrounded by death, knowing he had ended one life to save many, would you have felt the same cold acceptance Jimmy did, or would you have broken beneath the weight of what war demanded? Jimmy didn't break, not yet, but the forest had left its mark, a scar beneath the skin, and this was only the beginning. The ridge they were ordered to hold didn't look like much. At first glance, a rise in the land, barely taller than a farmhouse roof, its slopes littered with broken branches and churned-up soil. But the officers said it was important, strategically significant, which was army language for, if you lose this, men will die somewhere else. Jimmy didn't need the explanation. One look at the terrain told him enough. Anyone who controlled the ridge controlled the forest road that curved below it like a dark, twisting artery. The squad dug in at dusk, shovels biting into the frozen earth. Every strike sent vibrations up Jimmy's arms. The ground was stubborn, resisting them, as if even the soil understood what was coming and wished to deny them shelter. Men worked in strained silence, their breaths forming ghostly clouds in the cold air. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the ridge was dotted with shallow foxholes, not deep enough to feel safe, but better than lying exposed. Jimmy sat at the edge of his position, checking his rifle with methodical precision. The walnut stock felt slick beneath his gloves, a mixture of sweat and damp air seeping into the wood. He wiped it gently, remembering how his father used to polish it after every hunt, as if caring for the rifle were the same as caring for the man who held it. Below the ridge, the forest darkened into a mass of shifting shadows. Somewhere out there, Beyond the tree line, the enemy was moving. Jimmy could sense it in the way the wind carried faint metallic echoes, in the way the animals had vanished without a trace. It felt like the world was holding its breath. The lieutenant crawled over, his face lit by the faint glow of a covered lantern. "Thatch," he whispered. "You're our eyes tonight. If anything moves anything at all, you call it." Jimmy nodded. He didn't say he had already seen movement. He didn't say that something in the forest had been watching them for nearly an hour. He simply adjusted his scope and continued scanning the darkness. And if you had been there beside him, feeling the cold earth beneath your palms, hearing the distant creak of branches bending under unseen weight, you might have wondered the same thing he did. How long before the storm breaks? The first probing attack came just after midnight. It began with footsteps soft, deliberate, almost testing the ground. Jimmy picked them up before the others did. Faint vibrations carried through the soil into his forearms as he lay prone behind his rifle. He tapped twice on the wooden edge of the foxhole, the signal they'd agreed on. 2 taps meant incoming. The squad braced. No one spoke. No one dared breathe. Dark shapes materialized between the trees, silhouettes blending with the shifting gloom. They moved low, cautious, like hunters stalking wounded prey. For a moment, Jimmy wondered whether the Germans were just as afraid as they were men forced into a night that seemed to swallow every scrap of warmth and hope. A flare hissed to life, fired from somewhere behind the ridge. Its harsh white light blossomed above them, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest. And in that brief illumination, Jimmy saw everything with brutal clarity. A German advance team creeping forward, rifles raised, bayonets glinting like shards of ice. Gunfire erupted. The ridge became a furnace of muzzle flashes, shouts, and the cracking thunder of rifles echoing between the trees. Dirt rained down on Jimmy's back as bullets chewed into the slope behind him. He steadied his breathing, one inhale, one exhale, and took his first shot. The recoil nudged his shoulder, familiar and grounding. Through the scope, he watched one silhouette collapse silently. Another darted behind a tree. Jimmy adjusted without thinking, calculating angles that shifted with every heartbeat. He fired again. The Germans fell back quickly, leaving only the ragged echo of their retreat. The squad exhaled as one, a single weary breath shared among men who knew this was only the beginning. The lieutenant crawled to Jimmy's side, voice hoarse. "Good eyes, Thatch. You caught them before they were on top of us." Jimmy didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about the praise, or the kills, or the narrowness of their survival. His attention remained fixed on the tree line below, on the way the darkness seemed to rearrange itself, recovering, waiting. The first attack hadn't been an attempt to take the ridge. It had been a question, and Jimmy knew the real answer would come before dawn. The second attack came harder and faster than the first. It began with mortar fire, 3 sharp whistles slicing through the night, followed by explosions that tore open the ridge like monstrous claws. Earth erupted around them, spraying dirt and splinters into the air. The shockwave flattened the grass and rattled the breath out of their chests. Men ducked, cursed, pressed themselves into the shallow foxholes as if trying to disappear into the soil. Jimmy didn't flinch. He tracked the sound of the mortar tubes, gauging distance by instinct. Whoever was firing wasn't trying to wipe them out. They were softening the ridge, testing discipline, forcing panic to seep into the cracks of their defenses. You might think a man would be overwhelmed in a moment like that sound deafening, the ground shaking beneath him, but Jimmy felt the opposite. His mind sharpened. Every sense narrowed to a clean, cold point. He scanned the darkness through the smoke, reading patterns in the chaos like someone deciphering a familiar language. Figures emerged again, this time in greater numbers. They were not cautious now. They advanced with confidence, firing as they moved, the rhythmic bursts of their MP-40s flashing between the trees. The forest lit up with streaks of orange light. Jimmy shifted, angling his rifle downslope. He waited for the breath, his breath to sync with the movement of the nearest soldier. Then he fired. The man fell. Another appeared, sprinting for cover, and Jimmy adjusted a hair's width before firing again. His shots didn't echo like the others. They cut cleanly through the night, steady, surgical. Below him, Germans shouted orders. They expected the ridge to break. They expected the Americans to panic. But Jimmy wasn't panicking. The lieutenant crawled past him, shouting commands, rallying the men to hold the line. Bullets hissed overhead, snapping branches, tearing into the dirt. Still, Jimmy worked, calm in the storm, eliminating threats with a precision that frightened even the men beside him. After several minutes of brutal exchange, the German line faltered. One soldier shouted something urgent, and the group began to withdraw, dragging their wounded. The forest swallowed them again, leaving only silence and the lingering stench of gunpowder. Jimmy lowered his rifle, listening to the fading echoes. The attacks weren't random, they were coordinated, escalating, probing for weakness. And he knew deep in the quiet center of his thoughts that the worst was yet to come. The ridge had not been defended tonight. It had merely been asked whether it could be. The fifth wave did not arrive with hesitation. It came like a force that had finally made up its mind, an avalanche of discipline and fury moving through the trees with terrifying unity. Jimmy sensed it minutes before it revealed itself. Not through sound, not through movement, but through stillness. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, the way a field falls silent before a tornado touches down. Even the wind stopped, as if bracing for what was about to unfold. Then came the first sign, a distant rhythmic pounding, like hundreds of boots striking the forest floor in practiced synchrony. The vibrations reached Jimmy's elbows where they pressed into the dirt. He knew immediately this wasn't a probing attack. This was the real one. Men along the ridge stiffened. Some whispered brief prayers. Others swallowed hard, gripping their rifles so tightly their knuckles went bloodless. The lieutenant crawled to Jimmy's side, panting, sweat running muddy tracks down his face. "This is it," he said. "They're trying to break us." Jimmy didn't answer. He had already seen the shape of the battle forming in his mind, as if a map were unfolding in the space behind his eyes. The ridge, the tree line, the fog thickening at the bottom of the slope, every piece aligned itself with quiet precision. Through his scope, he finally saw them. Dozens of German soldiers emerged from the forest like specters, their helmets glinting faintly, their rifles held in tight formation. They didn't shout, they didn't rush. They advanced with the cold calculation of men who believed the ridge was already theirs. A mortar shell whistled overhead and exploded behind the American line, showering them with dirt and rocks. Another landed closer, ripping apart a section of foxhole and sending 2 men sprawling. Jimmy ducked instinctively, then lifted his rifle again, scanning for the officers leading the assault. He spotted one tall, confident, barking orders as he gestured toward the ridge. The man carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had survived many battles. Jimmy steadied his breath and squeezed the trigger. The officer dropped instantly, the formation around him faltering like a wave losing its crest. But the Germans didn't stop. They surged forward, rifles cracking, bullets carving violent paths through the dark. The ridge exploded into chaos, men shouting, dirt flying, shells bursting in vicious arcs of flame. Jimmy heard a scream to his right, and turned just in time to see Delaney clutching his shoulder, blood pouring between his fingers. The lieutenant dragged him back behind a fallen log, cursing as bullets snapped overhead. Jimmy shifted position, adjusting for the new angle of attack. He tracked a soldier sprinting for cover and fired. The man fell. A second appeared behind him. Jimmy led the shot by a fraction of a heartbeat and fired again. Below, the Germans began fanning out, trying to envelop the ridge from both sides. It was smart, an angle most defenders couldn't cover, but Jimmy could. His eyes darted between flanks, predicting movement before it happened. Each time a German soldier broke from the line, Jimmy's rifle cracked, leaving another dark shape collapsing into the moss. Still, they kept coming. A grenade landed close, rolling into the foxhole beside him. Jimmy kicked it out with a swift, desperate motion. It detonated mid-air, the blast rocking the ground and showering him with branches and mud. His ears rang violently, muffling the world into a low, pulsing hum. But even through the ringing, he could feel the forest shaking under the pressure of hundreds of advancing boots. One German soldier reached the lower rocks of the ridge and began climbing. Jimmy fired once, missing as the man ducked behind a boulder. The enemy popped out, firing upward, bullets chipping away the stone near Jimmy's cheek. Jimmy exhaled, let his heartbeat slow, and fired again. This time the shot hit clean. But victory didn't feel like victory. Not when the ridge trembled under the weight of the attack. Not when the German line kept advancing as though every fallen soldier were merely a marker showing the next man where to step. Jimmy wiped the sweat and dirt from his eyes. His shoulder throbbed from the recoil, his breath coming in short bursts. He could feel exhaustion creeping into his muscles, but he shoved it aside. He didn't have the luxury of being tired. The Germans were closer now, too close. Another mortar blast tore open the earth behind the Americans. The concussion wave knocked Jimmy onto his side, his rifle skidding a few inches away. He scrambled for it, dirt filling his mouth, ears ringing anew. As he lifted his head, he saw something that made his stomach clench. A sniper, perched in the fork of a broken tree limb, half hidden by fog and leaves, had a clean shot at the ridge. Not just at Jimmy, at everyone. If that sniper fired freely for even 30 seconds, the entire left flank would collapse. Jimmy felt it like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just another target. This was the pivot point of the entire battle. He steadied his rifle, but the angle was brutal. The sniper was nearly 250 yards away, elevated, concealed behind shifting fog. The shot would be nearly impossible even for him. The lieutenant shouted behind him, "Thatch! We're breaking on the left. We need that sniper down." Jimmy didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already committed. Breath in, breath out. The world slowed. The fog parted just enough for a silhouette to emerge, a dark figure clinging to the shattered tree, rifle angled toward the Americans. Jimmy felt the ground vibrating beneath him, the ridge crumbling, the battle tipping toward disaster. And for a moment, there was no war, no chaos, no fear. Only a boy on a Tennessee farm, breathing the way his father taught him. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. The sniper's silhouette jerked backward and disappeared from the branch, falling into the abyss of fog below. For 3 long seconds, the battlefield held its breath. Then the German assault faltered, hesitated, broke. The fifth wave collapsed like a tide pulled backward by a force greater than itself. Soldiers retreated, dragging their wounded, shouting orders that sounded more like panic than strategy. The forest swallowed them with the same eerie silence with which it had released them. Jimmy lowered his rifle, chest heaving, ears buzzing with leftover tremors from the blast. His hands shook not from fear, but from the immense weight of what that single shot had determined. The ridge had survived, but only by the width of a heartbeat. When the shooting finally stopped, the ridge felt unnervingly hollow, as if the world had suddenly emptied itself of sound. Smoke curled upward from shattered tree stumps, drifting lazily into the gray morning light. The forest, moments ago a roaring furnace of gunfire and chaos, now sat in bruised silence, its branches sagging, its soil torn and bleeding. Jimmy rose slowly from his position, his legs trembling in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. He walked a few steps forward, stepping over spent casings and fragments of torn bark. His heart was still thundering, but unevenly now, stumbling against itself. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fifth wave began to dissipate, leaving behind a strange emptiness, a kind of quiet ache just beneath the ribs. He wiped sweat, soot, and a streak of dried blood from his cheek, unsure when it had appeared. All around him, men moved like shadows. Some checked ammunition, hands shaking. Some tended to the wounded. Others sat with blank eyes, staring at places where comrades had stood only minutes earlier. Delaney, his shoulder wrapped in a makeshift bandage, leaned against a tree, breathing hard. He looked at Jimmy with something like disbelief or gratitude, but said nothing. Jimmy crouched beside his rifle, resting his palm on the stock, as though confirming it was real. The wood felt warm from repeated firing, but beneath the warmth was the familiar steadiness of something that had always been there to anchor him. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm, still swirling inside his chest. And if you were beside him kneeling in the wreckage of the ridge, listening to the muted groans of the wounded and the soft crackle of smoldering branches, you might have asked yourself the same question Jimmy now faced in the quiet of his own mind. After killing to survive, what part of a man is left untouched? Jimmy didn't know the answer, but he could feel, deep in his bones, that something inside him had shifted. The lieutenant found Jimmy sitting alone near the edge of the ridge, where the slope broke sharply into the fog-soaked forest below. For a moment, the officer said nothing. He simply lowered himself beside Jimmy, groaning as his tired knees cracked. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. They had endured something together that words could only cheapen. "You saved us," the lieutenant finally said, his voice rough, half drowned by exhaustion. "If that sniper had stayed up there, we'd be sending letters home instead of patching holes." Jimmy didn't respond right away. He watched the fog slide between the trees, curling around the jagged silhouettes like a living thing. The forest looked peaceful now, almost beautiful, and the contrast unsettled him. How could a place soaked in so much violence look so calm after the smoke cleared? The lieutenant studied him quietly. "You did what you had to do. Don't let your mind twist it into something darker." Jimmy lifted his eyes, and in them was a weight older than his years. "It's not the shot," he said softly. "It's how clear everything felt, how easy it was to choose." The lieutenant exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "War does that. Strips away the things that complicate a man's decisions, leaves only the brutal truth." He paused, then added, "But clarity isn't the same as cruelty." Jimmy didn't answer. He wasn't sure he believed it. Behind them, medics moved through the scattered survivors, calling names, checking pulses. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the harsher scent of burned wood. Somewhere nearby, a soldier sobbed quietly into his hands. Another stared blankly at his torn boot, as if trying to remember how it had gotten that way. Jimmy felt the weight of all of it pressing against him, the dead, the living, and the thin line that separated their fates. And if you were looking through his eyes in that moment, taking in the bruised landscape of the ridge and the fragile men clinging to it, you might have asked yourself the same question rising in Jimmy's chest. When survival becomes instinct, does humanity slip quietly away, or does it hide, waiting for the world to soften again? Jimmy hoped there was an answer, but he feared the war would take it from him before he ever found it. As afternoon crept slowly across the sky, the ridge settled into a fragile stillness, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the exhausted pause between tragedies. Medics had taken the wounded. The dead had been lined gently beneath torn canvas sheets. What remained were the men who were neither wounded nor whole, suspended in that strange space where survival offers no comfort, only questions. Jimmy found himself sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, hands clasped loosely, gaze unfocused. For the first time since dawn, his body began to register the damage it had endured. His shoulder throbbed from recoil, his knuckles were scraped raw, and a deep ache radiated through his ribs where the shockwave from a mortar blast had slammed into him. But the physical pain was distant, almost irrelevant. Something heavier weighed on him, the invisible bruise left behind when the mind confronts too much at once. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the one he had carried since basic training. Most of its pages were blank. He had planned to write letters home, maybe record thoughts or sketches of the places he passed. But war had a way of stealing the parts of a man that wrote gently. Still, he opened the notebook and stared at the empty page as if it might speak first. Nothing came. The lieutenant approached again, slower this time, his expression softer, less a commander, more a man trying to reach another across a widening divide. "You should rest," he said. "We'll regroup at dusk." Jimmy nodded, though he didn't move. He kept his eyes on the blank page before closing the notebook quietly. The page wasn't empty because he had nothing to say. It was empty because some things could not be captured in ink, not the weight of the sniper's fall, not the echo of the fifth wave breaking, not the sense that a piece of himself had remained down there in the fog. And if you had been there watching him close that notebook, knowing he would open it again only when the world felt less cruel, you might have felt the same realization creeping in. Survival was not victory. It was merely the promise that tomorrow would demand more of him. Jimmy stood slowly, bracing himself for whatever came next. Evening drew a long, amber line across the battered ridge, casting the forest into deep pockets of gold and shadow. The worst of the fighting had passed, yet the ground still held the memory of the chaos bootprints stamped into the mud, scorched soil where mortars had bloomed, and the faint, metallic smell of blood that refused to be carried away by the breeze. Jimmy stood on the higher slope, surveying what remained of the battlefield. In the softening light, it looked less like a place where men had tried to kill each other and more like the abandoned skeleton of a storm. His breathing was steadier now, though a dull heaviness lingered in his chest. Not fear, not even exhaustion, something in between. Something that came from having walked the thin edge between life and death for too long. The lieutenant approached again, this time with slower steps, as if the weight of the day had finally settled into his bones. "Command wants a report by nightfall," he said, rubbing his neck. "They're sending fresh units tomorrow. We won't be alone up here anymore." Jimmy nodded, though the words barely registered. Reinforcements meant safety, but also a reminder. The war was far from finished, and what they had survived today was only one chapter in a book that refused to close. Behind them, a few soldiers gathered near a small fire the medics had permitted, trying to coax warmth back into their trembling hands. Their voices were quiet, hushed, almost reverent. Not out of respect for the dead, but because they feared that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile stability had settled over the ridge. Jimmy watched the flames dance, bending and shifting in the dusk. Fire had always reminded him of home, of cold nights in Tennessee, of his father's calm voice telling stories, of Samuel laughing as sparks drifted into the dark. The memory ached, heavy and sudden, like someone had grabbed his ribs and pulled, and if you had been there standing beside him in that fading light, you might have wondered the same thing Jimmy now felt rising inside him. How does a man hold on to the pieces of who he was when the war keeps taking more than it gives? Jimmy didn't know the answer, but he could feel the question settling into him like a second heartbeat. As the fire crackled softly behind him, Jimmy walked a little farther down the slope, drawn by a quiet he couldn't explain. The air had cooled, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth scents that should have been comforting but now felt weighted with memory. He stopped beside a fallen tree trunk, its bark stripped raw by shrapnel, and lowered himself onto it slowly, his muscles stiff from strain. Below the ridge, fog pooled between the trunks like pale water. It moved in slow currents, swirling over the places where bodies had fallen earlier. Jimmy watched it drift, watched how the fading sunlight fractured through it in muted streaks, turning the battlefield into something unreal, something caught between nightmare and dream. He felt a strange pull in his chest, the kind that comes when the world outside grows distant while the world inside grows unbearably loud. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. No gunfire, no shouting, just wind brushing gently through the pines. It was the kind of silence men longed for during battle, but when it finally arrived, it carried a weight too heavy to rest beneath. Footsteps approached behind him, light, hesitant. It was Delaney. His arm was still bound tightly, stained through with dark patches of blood, but he stood upright, breathing slowly as though each inhale cost him something. "You good?" Delaney asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He looked at the young man, at the exhaustion hiding behind his eyes, at the tremor still lingering in his fingers. For a moment, Jimmy saw Samuel in him. Not the appearance, but the youth, the fragility hidden beneath a uniform too heavy for the boy wearing it. Finally, Jimmy said, "I'm here." Delaney let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess that's all any of us can say." They stood there together, not speaking, watching the fog settle over the forest like a blanket pulled over the day's wounds. And if you had been there, sharing their silence, you might have felt the truth pressing at the edges of your mind. Sometimes survival isn't measured in strength or courage, but in simply refusing to fall apart. Jimmy didn't fall apart, but he could feel the cracks forming. Night settled slowly over the ridge, bringing with it a quiet that felt almost sacred. The sky turned a deep, velvety blue, speckled with faint stars, struggling to break through the haze of lingering smoke. Lanterns flickered inside battered tents, casting long, yellow shapes onto the ground, shapes that moved like restless spirits searching for a place to rest. Jimmy sat near one of those lanterns, his back pressed against a tree whose trunk bore fresh scars from the morning's battle. He watched the camp with steady eyes. Men shuffled between fires, their movements heavy and uncoordinated. Some wrapped blankets around their shoulders, shivering despite the modest cold. Others stared into the flames as though hoping for answers hidden somewhere in the dancing embers. Jimmy recognized the look. It was the look of men replaying every moment they wished they could forget. A medic paused near him, adjusting the strap of a bulging supply bag. "You should get that shoulder looked at," he said gently. Jimmy hadn't realized he was favoring one side, nor that dried blood had seeped through his sleeve. But he shook his head. There were men who needed help more than he did. When the medic moved on, Jimmy leaned his head back, closing his eyes briefly. The dull ache in his shoulder pulsed in quiet waves, steady, patient, unconcerned with his endurance. Pain was honest, he thought. Pain didn't lie, didn't pretend, didn't disguise itself behind words. It arrived, stayed as long as it wished, and left only when it decided to. He let the thought linger before opening his eyes again. A gust of wind rustled the branches above him, scattering loose needles across his boots. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a low, haunting sound that echoed through the trees like a reminder that the world beyond the ridge still lived, still moved, still breathed. The war had not swallowed everything, and if you had been sitting beside Jimmy in that moment, listening to the night breathe around you, you might have understood the realization forming quietly inside him. A man survives a battle not by leaving it behind, but by learning to carry what it leaves within him. Jimmy inhaled deeply, letting the night settle into his lungs. Tomorrow, the war would rise again, and he would rise with it. Dawn returned quietly, as if unsure whether it had permission to touch the broken ridge. The first light crept slowly between the trees, painting the forest in pale gold and softening the harsh edges of the night before. The smoke had thinned, drifting upward in lazy spirals, and for a brief moment the battlefield looked almost gentle, like the war had stepped away and taken its cruelty with it. Jimmy stood at the highest point of the ridge, hands resting loosely on the barrel of his rifle. His face, still smeared with dried mud and traces of soot, looked older in the morning light. Not in years, but in weight. The kind of weight a man carries after seeing too much and saying too little. The reinforcements arrived just after sunrise, climbing the slope with nervous energy, boots crunching over scattered debris. Fresh-faced soldiers, some barely more than boys, looked around with wide eyes as they took in the cratered ground, the smashed trees, the burned grass. They saw the aftermath, but not the storm that had shaped it. One of them approached Jimmy, lifting his helmet in greeting. "Is this where it happened?" he asked quietly, as though raising his voice might awaken something dangerous. Jimmy nodded once. The boy stared at the ground for a long moment, then whispered, "How did you hold it?" Jimmy didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure how was the right question. Maybe the ridge had been held not by strength or strategy alone, but by fear, instinct, duty, rage, and something far more fragile, something a man reached for only when all other choices had been stripped away. But he said none of that. He simply replied, "We stayed." The lieutenant's voice called from behind him, summoning men for a briefing. Jimmy turned, watching the older officer's shoulders hunched, voice slightly hoarse, eyes red from exhaustion, yet sharp with purpose. The ridge had scarred everyone who had defended it, but the lieutenant carried his scars with a kind of quiet dignity, like a man who had learned long ago that leadership meant bleeding where his men could not see. Jimmy walked toward the small gathering near a half-collapsed tree trunk. The briefing was short. A new unit would take over the ridge by noon. Jimmy's squad, what remained of it, would be reassigned farther west. There were rumors of a major push, whispers of a town the Germans refused to relinquish. The war, relentless and hungry, was already pulling them toward the next storm. As the men dispersed, Jimmy lingered. His gaze drifted across the ridge one last time, tracing the paths where the Germans had climbed, where Delaney had fallen and risen again, where Meyer had been lost, where the sniper's body had disappeared into the fog. Every inch of it felt etched into him now, as permanent as a scar. He found himself walking slowly toward the tree where the sniper had perched. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing the jagged branch like a broken limb reaching toward the sky. Jimmy stood beneath it, feeling a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from understanding. The shot he had taken from this angle, from this distance, should not have been possible. But it had been necessary. He rested his hand on the tree trunk. The bark was rough, splintered, still carrying faint traces of gunpowder. For a long moment, he let his fingers feel the texture, grounding himself in the physical world, something real, something solid, before turning away. As he walked back toward the regrouping soldiers, he noticed Delaney sitting alone on a stump, rolling a small stone between his fingers. Jimmy sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Delaney said, "I thought I knew what war was. I really did." He paused, swallowing hard. "But yesterday, I don't know how any of us are still standing." Jimmy looked at him, seeing not fear, but the fragile honesty of a man stripped of illusions. "We stand," Jimmy said quietly, "because someone has to." Delaney let out a shaky breath, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess so." A bird called from somewhere deep in the forest, a thin, wavering note that felt out of place in the ruined landscape. But its presence mattered. It meant the world hadn't ended. It meant life still threaded itself through the cracks of war. It meant the ridge, despite everything, could breathe again. Jimmy rose as the sergeant shouted for the squad to form up. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, the familiar weight settling against his back. His legs were stiff, his shoulder ached, and his stomach churned faintly with hunger, but he moved forward. Because moving forward was the only direction the war allowed. As they began the march west, Jimmy glanced back one last time. The ridge stood quiet, bathed in soft morning light. Fresh soldiers were setting up new positions, talking among themselves, unaware of the ghosts that lingered there. It would become another chapter in a long list of battles, remembered by some, forgotten by others. But not forgotten by him. And if you were walking beside Jimmy in that moment, boots crunching over the wounded earth, watching the forest slowly swallow the ridge behind you, you might have understood the truth he carried silently in his chest. War doesn't end when the fighting stops. It ends when the memories finally loosen their grip. Jimmy didn't know when or if that day would come. But he kept walking, one steady step after another, into a world that demanded everything and promised nothing. A world where a man had to fight not only to survive, but to remain himself. When Jimmy Thatch walked away from that ridge, he didn't leave as the same young man who had arrived there the day before. Something had changed quietly, invisibly, but permanently. And maybe that is the real truth of war, not the victories written in reports, not the strategies debated in history books, but the silent transformations happening inside the men who must endure it. Because survival is never simple. It isn't clean. And it isn't free. It comes with memories that follow you long after the gunfire fades, memories of choices no man should ever have to make, and moments when a single breath separates life from death. And now, perhaps the most important question is the one only you can answer. If you were standing where Jimmy stood, if the fate of those beside you rested on one impossible decision, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you think. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the quiet truths hidden behind history, then make sure to subscribe. There are many more real stories waiting to be told, stories that deserve to be remembered.